You are listening to PastThink.com audiobook. Please like and subscribe, thank you. Chapter 90. A poor girl loses a padded jacket and puts up with some obstreperous behavior. A young man accepts a tray of sweetmeats and is put out by some devious goings-on. During the first week or so of Dayu's decline, when grandmother Jia and her aunts had taken it in turns to visit her, she had still possessed strength enough to make an occasional response to their inquiries. But now she would eat nothing whatsoever, and for several days had hardly said a word. The strange thing was that although at times she seemed unconscious, there were periods when she was perfectly lucid. They began to suspect something, and interrogated Nightingale and Snowgoose more than once. But the maids were too scared to say what they knew. Nightingale, for her part, while she would have liked to discover the latest news from Scribe, feared that the truth would only provide a further shock and hasten the hour of Dayu's death, and so when she saw Scribe, she avoided the subject completely. Snowgoose, as the transmitter of the news, felt responsible for Dayu's condition, and longed for 100 tongues to cry out, "I never said a word." She too, when questioned, maintained a close silence. Nightingale, seeing that Dayu would eat nothing, and judging that all hope was now gone, stood by her bedside crying for a while, then went outside and whispered to Snowgoose. "Go in and watch her carefully. I'm going straight over to tell her ladyship, and Mrs. Lien. She has definitely taken a turn for the worse today." She departed, and Snowgoose went in to take her place. She found Dayu lying very still, as if in a deep sleep. Being only a child with no experience of such things, she took this state for death itself, and began to feel both tearful and frightened. If only Nightingale would hurry up and come back. At that very moment she heard footsteps outside the window. That must be Nightingale now. Breathing a sigh of relief, she stood up at once and went to the doorway of the inner chamber, lifting the door curtain in expectation. She heard the swish of the outer door curtain, and in came not Nightingale, but Scribe, sent by Tanchun to inquire how Dayu was. Seeing Snowgoose standing in the inner doorway, she asked, "How is Miss Lin?" Snowgoose nodded to her to come in, and Scribe entered the inner room with her. She noticed that Nightingale was not there, and when she looked at Dayu, and saw how feebly she was breathing, a look of horror came over her face. "Where's Nightingale gone?" she asked. "To tell their ladyships," replied Snowgoose. Certain that Dayu, if not actually dead, was by this time at any rate dead to the world, Snowgoose decided to take advantage of Nightingale's absence to question Scribe. Taking her by the hand, she asked in a whisper, "Did you really mean what you said the other day, about Mr. Wang and Master Bao's betrothal?" "Of course I did," replied Scribe. "When was it settled?" "I never said it was. What I told you was just what I'd heard from Crimson. Later I was at Mrs. Lien's myself, and heard her say to Patience that the whole thing was something the master's literary gentlemen had thought up, to please him and provide themselves with a connection. As it happened, Lady Xing didn't even think it a good match. But even if she had approved, everyone knows how unreliable her judgment is. Besides, her old ladyship already has someone else in mind for Master Bao, someone here in the garden. Lady Xing had no idea of that, of course, and her old ladyship only allowed them to go ahead with the normal inquiries for the master's sake. Mrs. Lien said her old ladyship wants Bao Yu to marry one of his cousins, and her mind is quite made up, so any other proposals are a waste of time." Snowgoose was beside herself. "Then our mistress is dying for nothing," she exclaimed. "What do you mean?" asked Scribe. "Don't you know? The other day Miss Lin overheard me telling Nightingale about the betrothal. That's why she has brought herself to this terrible state now." Whispered Scribe. "She might hear you." "She's completely dead to the world," replied Snowgoose. "Look, she can't last more than a day or two now." As she was speaking, the door curtain was drawn aside, and in came Nightingale. "For goodness sake," she exclaimed. "Can't you two do your gossiping somewhere else? You might as well drive her to her death." I simply cannot believe such strange goings-on, muttered Scribe. My dear Scribe, retorted Nightingale, don't misunderstand me please. I didn't mean to offend you, but you must be so stupid to gossip like that. The three of them were interrupted by a sudden cough from Dayu's bed on the Kong. Nightingale hurried to the bedside, while Snowgoose and Scribe stood in silence. Nightingale bent down and whispered to Dayu, who was lying with her face to the wall. Would you like some water, miss? There was a barely audible yes, and Snowgoose promptly filled a cup half full with hot water, and handed it to Nightingale, who held it in the palm of her hand. Scribe meanwhile had moved towards the Kong, and was about to speak to Dayu, when Nightingale motioned to her not to say anything, and she checked herself. They stood waiting. After a short interval Dayu coughed again, and Nightingale inquired at once. Would you like the water now, miss? There was another faint yes, and Dayu seemed to want to lift her head, but was too feeble to do so. Nightingale climbed up onto the Kong by her side and, holding the cup in her hand, first tested the water to make sure it was not too hot, then raised it to Dayu's mouth, supporting her head until the rim of the cup reached her lips. Dayu took a sip, and Nightingale was about to remove the cup when she saw that Dayu wanted some more. She held the cup where it was. Dayu drank again, shook her head to show that it was enough, took a deep breath, and lay down once more. After a pause she opened her eyes a fraction and asked. Was that Scribe I heard talking just now? Yes, miss, replied Nightingale. Scribe was still in the room, and came up to the Kong at once to convey Tan Chun's message. Dayu stared at her for a minute and nodded. After a pause she said. When you go home, give Miss Tan my regards, will you? Scribe took this to mean that Dayu wanted her to leave, and made her way quietly out of the room. Now although Dayu's condition was extremely grave, her power of reason was unimpaired. She was aware of Scribe's arrival and vaguely heard the first words she exchanged with Snowgoose. She felt too exhausted to cope with a visitor, and so pretended to be asleep. But as the conversation progressed, it became clear to her that what she had taken to be a fact had never been more than a proposal. And then she heard Scribe repeat Shifeng's words, that Grandmother Jia intended to marry Bao Yu to one of his cousins, to one that lived in the garden, and who could that be but herself? Just as at the winter solstice Yin gives birth to Yang, so now in her mind darkness gave way to light. She suddenly felt much clearer within herself, decided to drink some water, and even spoke to Scribe. It was at this moment that Grandmother Jia, Lady Wang, Li Wan and Shifeng arrived on the scene, in response to Nightingale's urgent summons. Now that Dayu's inner doubts had been so dramatically dissipated, she no longer presented the spectacle of the dying maiden that Nightingale had led them to expect. She was still weak and low in spirits, but was able with an effort to say a few words in reply to their inquiries. Shifeng called Nightingale over and questioned her. Miss Lin is not nearly as ill as you made out. Why did you exaggerate so? We were most alarmed. Honestly, ma'am, replied Nightingale, only a while ago she was in a bad way. That's why I came over. I would never have dared to bother you otherwise. She does seem a lot better now. It's most strange. Grandmother Jia said to Shifeng with a smile. You shouldn't take what she says so seriously, my dear. She doesn't understand such things. Mind you, she was quite right to speak up if she noticed anything the matter. I've no time for young people who never say a word or do anything for fear of appearing foolish. The ladies stayed for a few minutes chatting, then, deciding that all was well, returned to their apartments. Truly, no remedy but love can make the lovesick well. Only the hand that tied the knot can loose the tiger's bell. After this, Dayu's condition continued to improve steadily, and Snowgoose and Nightingale offered many a secret prayer of thanks to the Lord Buddha. Thank goodness she's better, said Snowgoose to Nightingale. But what an odd illness. And what an odd way to get better. We know what caused it, said Nightingale. It's this sudden recovery that's puzzling. I think Bao Yu and Miss Lin must be destined to be married after all. The course of true love never did run smooth, but marriages made in heaven can never be broken either. You can tell they are destined to be together. That's what they both want in their hearts, and that must be what heaven has decreed for them. Remember what happened to Bao Yu last year, when I told him Miss Lin was going home to the south? He nearly died of shock, and made the most terrible scene. And now that one remark of ours has nearly been the death of her. Theirs must be a bond from some previous life, made a century ago at the Rock of Rebirth. They exchanged a secret smile at this romantic theory, and Snow Goose exclaimed, "Thank goodness she's better anyway. We must never mention it again. Even if Bao Yu were to marry another lady, and I witnessed the wedding with my own eyes, I swear I wouldn't breathe a word of it to anyone." Nightingale laughed. Well said. Theirs were not the only secret discussions on this subject. Dai Yu's strange illness and stranger recovery gave rise to a great deal of whispering and speculation in the household, which soon reached the ears of Shifeng. Lady Wang and Lady Xing vaguely suspected something, and Grandmother Jia herself had a shrewd idea what was at the bottom of it all. The four ladies were gathered one day in Grandmother Jia's apartment, and in the course of their conversation the subject of Dai Yu's illness came up. "There is something I want to say to you all," said Grandmother Jia. "Bao Yu and Miss Lin have been together ever since they were little, and this has never troubled me, as I have always thought of them as children. But of late I have noticed how frequent these illnesses of hers are becoming, how suddenly they come, and how suddenly they go, a sure sign that she is growing up. It really won't do to allow them to stay together indefinitely. What do you all think?" After a thoughtful silence, Lady Wang replied, choosing her words with care. "Miss Lin reads such a lot into things. And Bao Yu's childish manner is deceptive, he can be extremely stupid and tactless. If we remove either one of them from the garden, won't it be too obvious? It has always been said that every boy becomes a groom, and every girl becomes a bride. Don't you think, Mother, that a better solution would be to go ahead as quickly as possible and get them both married?" Grandmother Jia frowned. "I know that Miss Lin's peculiar temperament is in some ways attractive. But I don't think we could possibly have her as a wife for Bao Yu. Besides, I'm afraid that with such a delicate constitution, she is unlikely to live to any age. I'm sure Bao Chai is in every respect the more suitable choice." "Of course we all agree with you there, Mother," said Lady Wang. "But we must find a husband for Miss Lin too. If we do not, and if she has taken a fancy to Bao Yu, after all, it is only natural for a girl to have such feelings as she grows up. It might make things very difficult if she were then to discover that he was already betrothed to Bao Chai." "There can be no question," replied Grandmother Jia, "of marrying an outsider before one of the family. The order must be, first to marry Bao Yu, then to have Miss Lin betrothed. Besides, Miss Lin is 2 years younger than Bao Yu anyway. If I understand you correctly, we shall have to conceal Bao Yu's betrothal from her." Shifeng turned at once to the various maids present. "Is that clear? Not a word of Master Bao's betrothal to anyone. If I catch one of you talking about it, I shall show no mercy." "Feng dear," continued Grandmother Jia, "I have noticed that since your illness you have taken less interest in what happens in the garden. You really must give it more of your attention. It's not just the sort of thing we have been talking about. Any repetition of that disgraceful drinking and gambling that was discovered among the servants last year must be prevented at all costs. Be rather more particular, will you, and keep a watchful eye on what goes on. They need to be disciplined, and you seem to be the one they respect most." "Yes, Granny," said Shifeng. The ladies sat talking for a while longer, then left to go their separate ways. From now on, Shifeng began to inspect the garden on a more regular basis. One day, in the course of one of her tours of inspection, she was walking along the bank by Amaryllis Ayat, when she heard an old woman shouting outside the courtyard, and went to investigate. As she drew near, the old serving woman caught sight of her, dropped her hands to her side, and stood to attention, mumbling a confused "Good morning, ma'am." Why are you making such a racket out here? Asked Xifeng. You and Mrs. Zhu have given me a job to do here, ma'am, replied the woman, looking after the flower beds and fruit trees. I'd done nothing wrong, and Miss Xing's maid accused us of stealing. And why should she do that? Asked Xifeng. Yesterday our Blackie came with me here to play, replied the woman. She didn't know any better, and went inside Miss Xing's apartment to have a look around. I sent her home straight away. Then early this morning I heard one of the maids say they'd lost something. When I asked what it was, she started questioning me all about it. That's no cause for you to lose your temper, retorted Xifeng. This garden belongs to Mrs. Zhu's family, not hers, protested the old woman. We work for Mrs. Zhu and I won't be called a thief. Xifeng spat straight in the old woman's face and said harshly. Hold your tongue. That's quite enough. You're responsible for things here, and if something is lost the maids are quite right to hold you accountable for it. How dare you talk such nonsense? Call Steward Lin and have her dismissed. The maids were carrying out her orders when Xing Xiaoyan came hurrying out. She greeted Xifeng and said with an anxious smile. You mustn't do that. It was nothing really. And it's all over now. My dear girl, said Xifeng, that is not the right attitude to take. It's the principle I'm concerned with. The servants must learn to know their place. Xiaoyan saw that the woman was on her knees begging for mercy, and asked Xifeng once to go inside with her and sit down. I know her sort, said Xifeng. They think they can get away with anything, except when I'm around. When Xiaoyan continued to plead for the woman, however, and insisted on putting the blame on her own maid, she relented. Out of consideration for Miss Xing, she announced, I shall let you off this once. The old woman came forward to kowtow first to Xifeng then to Xiaoyan, and left. Once she had gone, Xiaoyan asked Xifeng to be seated. What was it that you lost? Inquired Xifeng pleasantly. Nothing of any importance, replied Xiaoyan with a smile. Just an old red padded jacket of mine. I told them to look for it, and when it didn't turn up thought no more about it. My maid was silly to question that woman. She was bound to take offense. My maid was very thoughtless, and I've already given her a good talking to. The whole affair is over and best forgotten. While she was speaking, Xifeng had been inspecting Xiaoyan's clothes, and the general appearance of her apartment. Her few padded or fur-lined clothes looked rather worn and ineffective as protection against the cold. Most of her quilted bedding looked on the thin side too. She glanced at the furniture and the ornaments on her table, all of them provided by grandmother Jia, and noticed how immaculately clean and tidy they had been kept. Xifeng felt a warm respect towards her. I know a jacket is nothing to fuss over, she said. But the weather is growing cold, and you need it to keep you warm. Of course you were right to question her. Honestly. The insolent way these servants carry on. She sat talking with Xiaoyan for a while, and then left to continue her tour of inspection, stopping off in all the various residences before returning to her own apartment. There she instructed patients to make up a parcel of her clothes to be sent over to Xiaoyan. It was to contain 2 padded jackets, one of dark red imported silk, the other of Viridian damask silk lined with pearly lamb's wool, a long turquoise worsted skirt with brocade applique panels and an embroidered border, and a deep blue ermine-lined jacket. Despite Xifeng's intervention on her behalf, Xiaoyan was still most mortified by the woman's rudeness. Of all the girls who live here, she thought to herself, I'm the only one the servants would dare to offend in that way. They say things about me all the time. And now Feng has seen it for herself. The more she thought about it, the more depressing her position seemed. And yet it was impossible for her to confide in anyone. Bowing to her fate, she was just beginning to weep when she saw Xifeng's maid Felicity come in carrying a bundle of clothes. Soon realizing whose they were, she absolutely refused to accept them. But miss, protested Felicity, Mrs. Lien says that if you think they are too old she will change them for newer ones. Xiaoyan smiled politely. It's very thoughtful of her. But I can't possibly let her give me some of her clothes just because I've lost one of mine. Please take them back and thank her most kindly for me. I do appreciate the thought. She gave her a little purse, and Felicity departed with some reluctance, carrying the bundle. Minutes later she was back, this time accompanied by Patience. Xueqin hurried out to greet them, and asked them both to be seated. Patience smiled and said, Mrs. Lien says you should accept them as one of the family, and not be so polite. But I'm not being polite, replied Xueqin. Honestly. I'd be embarrassed to take them. Mrs. Lien says, persisted Patience, that if you won't take them it must either be because they're too old, or because you don't like the idea of wearing her things. She says that if I take them back she'll be cross with me. Xueqin blushed and smiled gratefully. Well, in that case, how can I possibly refuse? Please convey my thanks to Mrs. Lien. She served them both tea, after which Felicity and Patience left. They were almost home again when they met one of Aunt Xue's women. She greeted them, and Patience asked her where she was going. Mrs. Xue and our young lady sent me over to convey their regards to all their ladyships, and young madams, and young ladies. I was at Mrs. Lien's just now asking for you, and she told me you'd gone into the garden. Have you just been to Miss Xing's by any chance? Why, how did you know that? Asked Patience. Oh, a little birdie told me. It's most generous, I think, what you and your mistress are doing. Patience gave a little laugh. Won't you come in and have a chat later on? I still have things to do. Another day, replied the old woman and went on her way, while Patience went in to report to Shifeng. When the serving woman returned to the Xue household, which was in its usual state of upheaval, thanks to the disruptive behavior of Xia Jingui, she recounted the story of Xing Xiaoyan's humiliation, and both Aunt Xue and Bao Chai began to weep. It's only because Pan's away, said Bao Chai, that she has to go on suffering like this. We are lucky that Feng has been looking after her. In future we must keep more of an eye on her ourselves. She is after all practically one of the family now. As she was speaking, Xueqin came in. In all the years he's spent here, Pan hasn't made a single decent friend, he said. They're a pack of rogues, the lot of them. I'm sure they don't care in the slightest what happens to him. They're only curious to know the latest news. This last couple of days I've told them all to go away, and I've given the janitors instructions not to let any of them in. Is it that actor Jiang and his friends again? Asked Aunt Xue. No, as a matter of fact he hasn't been here at all. It's a different crowd. Xueqin's words intensified Aunt Xue's anxiety. Though I have a son, she said, it is as though I had none. Even if Pan wins this reprieve, his life is ruined. You are only my nephew, Ku, but you show much more sense than Pan. I can see that from now on I shall have to depend on you. Be sure to work hard, and make the most of your life. And think of your bride-to-be, who comes from a family that has fallen on hard times. It is always hard when a daughter goes out into the world and gets married. One can only pray that her husband will turn out well, and be capable of providing for her. Imagine if Xueqin were to turn out like this creature here. Gesturing in the direction of Xia Jingui's room, Aunt Xue continued. But I don't want to talk about her. I know Xueqin to be an honest and thoughtful girl, thrifty and unspoilt. The sooner Pan's business is settled, the sooner we can get the two of you married and set my poor heart at rest. Don't forget that Bao Qin is still waiting to be married, Xueqin reminded his aunt. I know how concerned you are about that. Don't worry on our account. They stayed chatting together for a few minutes longer, and then Xueqin returned to his room. He ate his dinner and began to think about Xueqin in the garden, forced by poverty to be so utterly dependent on the Jiaos. The two of them had traveled by the same boat on their original journey to the capital, and he had been able to see for himself that she was a pretty, good-natured girl. How unjust of destiny to give a creature like Xia Jingui a life of wealth and luxury, and turn her into a spoilt shrew, while for a girl like Xueqin there was nothing but hardship. What was in the mind of the great arbiter Yama when he made such a dispensation? These gloomy thoughts stirred Xueqin to express his sense of injustice in poetic form. His was an untutored pen, but he did as best he could. As the flood dragon flounders on the shore, so our two hearts languish under like privations. When will we drink this bitter cup no more, and soar unfettered through the constellations? He read the lines through and thought of sticking them up on his wall. He felt a little self-conscious, however, and thought to himself, what if someone sees them and makes fun of me? He read them through again. Oh, who cares? I will put them up. I can read them anyway, to cheer myself up. A final reading made him change his mind yet again, however, and he slipped them between the pages of a book. I'm old enough for us to be married now, he mused to himself. But who could have foreseen this family crisis, and who knows when it will ever end? What an ordeal for a gentle girl like Xueqin. How lonely and wretched she must feel. At that moment the door was pushed open and Moonbeam came in carrying a round-covered tray and a jug of wine, which she deposited with a simpering smile on the table. He rose and asked her to be seated. Still smiling, she said, "For plates of sweetmeats and a small jug of wine, with Mrs. Pan's compliments, Master Ko." "It's most kind of her," replied Ko, "but surely she could have sent one of the younger maids? She didn't need to bother you, Miss Moonbeam." "Oh, Master Ko, there's no need to be so polite. It's all in the family after all. Mrs. Pan knows what trouble you've been put to on account of Mr. Pan, and she's been meaning for a long time to thank you herself, but was afraid the others might take it the wrong way. In this household, as I think you know, sir, there's a lot goes on beneath the surface. People are only waiting to pounce on a little thing like a present, and then they start inventing all kinds of stories. That's why she's been ever so slightly discreet, and asked me to come over personally with these few things today, when no one was looking." She gave Xueqin a saucy smile, and continued, "And please, no more of that, Miss Moonbeam, it makes me feel most uncomfortable. We are only here to serve, and if we can serve Mr. Pan, then why not you as well?" Xueqin was young and had a trusting nature. It was odd that Pan's womenfolk should suddenly start treating him like this, but Moonbeam's explanation was a plausible one, he reflected. "You can leave the sweetmeats," he said, "but take the wine back with you. I've never been much of a drinker. Occasionally, if pushed to it, I can manage a cup, but usually I don't drink at all. Surely you and Mrs. Pan knew that?" "Ask anything else of me," pleaded Moonbeam. "But I wouldn't dare take it back, you know Mrs. Pan's temper. If I tell her you don't drink, she'll never believe me, she'll say I've failed in my duty." Reluctantly, Xueqin allowed her to leave the wine too. Moonbeam began to leave, but on reaching the doorway she took a quick look outside, and glanced back at Xueqin with a smile. Pointing in the direction of Xia Jingui's apartment, she said, "I think she might even come over herself to thank you for all you've done." Xueqin was not sure how to take this, and began to feel rather nervous. "Please convey my thanks to Mrs. Pan, will you? The weather is cold, and she must be careful not to catch a chill. Besides, she is my cousin's wife, and there's no need for her to go to such lengths." Moonbeam said nothing but tittered and went on her way. At first Xueqin had been prepared to accept the offering as a genuine expression of gratitude on Jingui's part. But now Moonbeam's suggestive behavior had aroused his suspicions, and he began to think there was something fishy going on. But surely Jingui would never think of such a thing, he argued with himself. She is my sister-in-law. Perhaps it's Moonbeam up to no good. She can't very well act on her own initiative. Maybe she is using Jingui as a cover. But then she's Pan's chamber wife, so that's hardly very. Suddenly it occurred to him. Of course. Jingui's no lady. Sometimes when she's in the mood, she gets herself up like a regular harlot. She obviously fancies herself as some sort of man-killer. Another possibility is that she's fallen out with Bao Qin, and this is a plot to disgrace me and drag the family name in the mud. Xueqin could not help finding all this rather daunting, and was racking his brains for some means of dealing with the situation, when to his great alarm he heard a splutter of laughter outside the window. But to discover who was laughing, you must turn to the next chapter.